against the flood. I will try to answer as many of them as I can. Show that the Bible is indeed God's word, and that the flood truly occurred. As we look at this, we were looking at last week radiocarbon, which is carbon-14 dating, and we got into dendrochronology, that's tree ring dating. And of course, that's from two words. Chronos is time, and ology is the sayings or the collected thoughts regarding the matter, and dendros is the tree. So tree ring chronology, tree chronology, or chronology according to tree ring dating usually. Now, we looked at the bristlecone pine. I just talked about it a little bit. Several years ago, I went to Utah and out in that area and took a trip out there, and I went out and got pictures of some bristlecone pines. This is in south central Utah. And here's some bristlecone pines that have died. But some of these trees are maybe 500, 600, 700, 800, or close to 1,000 years old. They're very slow growing trees, but they are quite old. Here's another bristlecone pine tree, and they looks pretty scrubby looking, but they live a long time. Yeah, I just thought I'd show you some pictures I took of some of them. This is in the state of Utah in the United States. And we want to look, that just adds to our last week's lesson. That's all it does. Here's some geologic formations which cannot be explained with uniformitarian assumptions. Slow, gradual changes. We have regions called overthrust, as mentioned previously. We discussed them a little bit previously. Display characteristics cannot be explained by uniformitarian assumptions. Now, overthrust faults, they call them. We have, starting with this right here, and then supposedly this slides over the top of this up here. So this layers of rock slides over the top. Now I could see that occurring for a few feet, but we have overthrusts that run for miles and miles, supposedly. Now when you start sliding very heavy bit of rock over top of other rock, the forces involved in doing that would just crush and pulverize the rocks underneath it. These forces, these rocks moving, and they would shatter and crack and actually pulverize the other rocks. Here it is. I'm taking this out of some Geologic websites. This is how they describe it. And it slides up like this. And so that this right here started out the same layer and it winds up above it. And then this winds up above some material over here. So this slides underneath it here. But what they're showing you here, and we can see this occurring on a small scale, but they show this, what we see is some of these are actually run for miles and miles. And this, what we have is we have supposedly younger rock. Now, it makes perfectly good sense. The old rock will be on the bottom, the young rock on top. Makes perfectly good sense. But what they have is they have some of the younger rock underneath the older rock. And they claim this has been due to an overthrust. Here's your Cambrian, and then your Precambrian is above it. This is a picture of it. This is Airdellog Peninsula, and that's in Scotland. Yeah. So here we have the old rock on top, Precambrian, and the younger rock on the bottom for miles and miles. In the United States, there's a Lewis Overthrust Fault, the most well-known overthrust system. Older rock was slid over younger rock for a distance of about 50 miles. And you start pushing down. The top rock is supposedly 1.3 million years old, 1.3 billion, I'm sorry, years old, older than the rock on the bottom. That's 1,300 million, which would be 1.3 billion years older than the rock on the bottom. Now, using a billion, that's using the United States, a billion is 1,000 million. This is all done without damaging the younger rock underneath it. That's most interesting. That large weight, pushing forces, did not damage the rock that's underneath the lower rock, the younger rock. So it's very interesting that this occurred. And these men do not believe in miracles. These are men that claim this happened. They don't believe in miracles. And if you know anything about the forces, and if a person had a good engineering degree, he would probably take strength of materials course. And if he had a good physics major, he would study some of that as well. So these men, they just don't believe in miracles, but they believe that younger rock was underneath that older rock, and it slid. The older rock slid over it and didn't damage the younger rock underneath it. I find that amazing that they would believe that, and that yet they would believe in miracles. Questions regarding overthrust. What size of overthrust would we have to disprove their system? We know we got an overthrust running up close to 50 miles, right at 50 miles in the Lewis overthrust in the United States. And a rock that's over 1 billion years older, according to their dating system, is on the top, and the younger rock underneath it is below it. And the younger rock's not damaged. So what would an overthrust of continental proportions, would it disprove their system? Second, if it didn't, then what would disprove their system? What would disprove? Third, how large would an area of overthrust need to be to disprove their system? All right, we know overthrust exists. Now then, I asked the question, how did they arrive at their answers to these three questions? And I would ask them to defend their answers. Now, they come up with something called a rhid. That's from a Greek word, but it differs from a liquid in being able, this is Holmes' definition of it, in being below the melting point and having a certain amount of strength. It flows in virtue of relatively long duration of the deforming stress. Let me point out something here. In Oklahoma City, our snow is slicker than the snow up in Minnesota. And someone says, well, you're just being silly. No, I'm not. What happens is our snow a lot of times will sit there around 30 degrees, 31 degrees, just slightly below freezing. And when cars run over the snow or ice that's around 31 degrees Fahrenheit or right at 32, you put the pressure of the weight of an automobile on top of that ice, it'll melt the ice. So if you put ice under pressure, if the ice is not too cold, it'll melt the ice. And when the pressure is released, it immediately refreezes. And so right here, we get that occurring with ice. And so that's well known to be the case. That's why our roads in Oklahoma will sit there around 31 degrees and cars run over the snow, and then it turns into ice. The snow turns to ice because it melts under the pressure and immediately refreezes, not as snow anymore, but as ice. So he's talking about a rhid, they call it a rhid, and so it flows in virtue of the relatively long duration of the deforming stress. Now, I was going to write a novel one time and thought about writing this, a murder novel and a murder story, where you can take a piano wire, for example, and put weights on a big block of ice, and then put that piano wire running across the block of ice, and the piano wire, the weight of that would melt the ice. Whenever the piano wire went through it and it melted it due to its pressure, it would immediately refreeze above the piano wire. And over time, that piano wire would work its way down through. And then I was going to have it to perform a murder of some sort, just for a story that I was going to write. But I just didn't get around to doing it. But what would happen there is it would get rid of all the evidence as to how it had occurred, because the ice would refreeze above it. So it would hang above someone's head and cut their head off or something like that. I just didn't go through with the story, writing a short story on this. But this happens, and it can happen. And it does happen with ice. And so in this case, they're saying, well, this happens with rocks. Well, it does happen with ice, we know that. And Holmes uses ice as his example of rheidivity. And so on page 204, and so he used that as example. Ice bends at a temperature near its melting point. And so to say that this happens, ice will bend when it's near its melting point. Now, if the ice is like minus 100 degrees Fahrenheit, it takes a lot of pressure for doing the melting. And what we have here is it bends at a temperature near its melting point, but the rocks are not near their melting point. So the parallel in using the ice as an example of it just won't prove anything, because the rocks are not near their melting point of the rocks when this occurs. So that's the problem with it. And so this occur with ice. And so he goes on and uses some more. Now Harris does. Carefully constructed experiments have shown that for liquids which expand on freezing, such as water, increasing the pressure lowers the freezing point. The effect is very slight, however, because it takes a pressure of 1,500 pounds per square inch to lower the freezing point of water by 1 degree Fahrenheit. The increase in pressure of 1 atmosphere lowers the freezing point by only about 0.007 degrees Celsius. So again, what he's saying here is water ice has to be near the freezing point. Temperature does, and it takes a lot of pressure for it to occur if it's below the freezing point. First, the ice deforms at or near its melting point, but the atheist is not postulating that these rocks were near their melting points when they're bent. This is another reason to reject their analogy. Analogy doesn't prove anything in logic anyhow, it just illustrates something. And so it really doesn't prove anything. The fact that what happened at or near the melting point of the ice doesn't prove anything about what happens with the rocks when they're not even anywhere near their melting point. And according to the quote we gave here, this applies to liquids which expand on freezing. And most rocks do not necessarily expand on freezing. Most of them will contract. Third, another problem with this theory of rheidivity is that it is absurd to think that layers of rock composed of different materials would all bend at the same rate. It's necessary for them to bend at the same rate, because if they do not bend at the same rate, it causes some of the rocks to fracture while others are bent. So again, we have another problem with this, because we have different kinds of rocks, different structures, different materials in the rocks, layers of rocks. Another problem is in providing a force that remains constant for literally hundreds of millions of years that can bend a rock. So they say these rocks took millions of years to bend, that's why we can't see them. Of course, that's not science, because they can't see it occur in the rocks. And if you apply forces, and I've done it, to a brittle rock, at some point, it'll reach a point where it'll fracture. The rock will break. And that does occur. And if you have a good class in strength of materials, like in engineering school or in physics, you'd see that to be the case. Rheidivity, remember, let's go back and look at it now. is based on substantive uniformitarianism is incompatible with infrequent catastrophism. Why? Because they say it takes a constant force for millions of years. And when they rejected uniformitarian principles and the substantive uniformitarianism, they obviously, when they rejected that, then they gave up this argument here. But you see, they come right back to uniformitarian arguments because they just can't get around it. They have to have uniformitarianism. There are at least 8 phenomena that cannot be explained if the Earth is billions of years old and uniformitarian assumptions are correct. Let's get several phenomena. The following slide will consider these 8 phenomena. We'll be considering them as we look at them. Natural oil seepage. About 80 to 90% of the present discovered oil is found in Mesozoic and Tertiary rocks, according to Wilson. About 80 to 90%. Mesozoic period supposedly began about 225 million years ago and ended about 65 million years ago. The Tertiary period supposedly began about 65 million years ago and ended about 2.5 million years ago. Dating. Now, what about marine oil seepage? Seepage up to the bottom of the ocean. Within this range, the best estimate for present marine seepage worldwide is on the order of 0.6 times 10 to the 6th. That's 0.6, 10 to the 6 is a million, and that's 600,000 metric tons per year. And that's just the seepage of it through the ground up in the floor of the ocean. If this rate of seepage continued for 100 million years, let's use uniformitarian assumptions, there will be a total seepage of 0.6 times 10 to the 14th. That's, you move the decimal point on the 0.6, 14 places to the right, and that's will be your number. Move it over 14 places, that'll be your number. That's metric tons. Now, metric ton is 2,000. It's 2,000. It's 1,000 kilograms, and so it's sometimes written as TONNE in some countries, in England and other places. But it's 1,000 kilograms, so it would be 2,200 pounds roughly. Okay, a little bit bigger than what we call a short ton will be 2,000 pounds. Okay. That there are 7.5 barrels of oil in a metric ton, and so there's 7.15 barrels of oil in that. So that's how many barrels of oil would have come up through the ocean. Now, what about natural gas seepage? One of the things they discovered when they mapped the Earth, natural gas gives off a certain spectrum of light, and satellites can map the Earth and find natural gas coming up through the ground. Natural gas tends to migrate upward because it's under great pressure, because of the permeability of the rocks. Now, permeability means the ability for it to permeate or to go through the rocks. And so this happens, natural gas does the ground. Without this permeability, the natural gas cannot be extracted from the rocks. The rocks have to be allowed to permeate so you can get it out of the ground to be used in gas wells, natural gas wells. There's no reason for natural gas to remain in the natural gas reservoir for millions of years because it's coming out of the ground. The only thing that would make it occur is if it was being recycled somehow and there was something creating the natural gas underneath, but they say fossil fuels did that. Their claim is that it's the fossil fuel. But see, so they have a problem here. Where did all this natural gas go that was permeating through the rocks all this time? The reversal of the direction of the Earth's magnetic field is another problem. The atheist claims the magnetic field of the Earth has changed polarity a number of times. They make this change. Because of the decay of the field, he is either forced to make this claim or accept the fact that the Earth's only a few thousand years old. Because we know the Earth's magnetic field has been decaying. So we have a problem. The atheist has a problem with this. The presence of rings around several of the planets. Like a radical idea, instead of forming with Saturn 4.5 billion years ago, the planet's resplendent rings are really less than 100 million years old. To process argue that the rings are short-lived. Now, let's talk about the rings of Saturn, which are really quite spectacular. First, Saturn's moons exert gravitational tugs on the ring system and are stealing orbital energy from the myriad small particles it comprises. As particles lose momentum, they slowly spiral towards Saturn. Another process acting to bring about the ring's demise is the constant pelting they endure from cometary dust grains. So cometary dust hits them. I remember the United States put up a big satellite that was just a big balloon up in the air, up in space. They were going to bounce signals off it before they actually put satellites up. And so they would send signals up and bounce them off this satellite. It's called Telstar. But it didn't last very long because there was some gas in space. And then, of course, the solar wind was a problem. And so this was a problem with it. So it eventually came down and burned up in our atmosphere. But this was probably in the 1960s or 1970s that occurred. Let's go back here now. These high velocity projectiles that's coming solar wind erode larger ring particles, and the collisional residue is more easily drawn towards Saturn, again implying a lifetime of only 100 million years. Furthermore, because comet dust is as black as coal, adding only a small amount of it to the rings would make them very dark. So again, comet dust should have made them black and dark, and so they wouldn't be reflecting. Saturn's B ring displays bright particles, surfaces of pure ice, implying that they have not been exposed to comet dust for very long. Now, I know Sky and Telescope is not considered a scholarly journal, but they do provide information for us. This refutes the dust cloud theory of the extinction of the dinosaurs. The rings would be covered with dust if this were true. If we had a large dust cloud that caused the extinction of the dinosaurs, blocked out the sun's light for a period of time, then the rings would have been covered with dust, the rings of these planets. A dust cloud coming from outer space, would have to go through the gauntlet of the large Jovian planets. The Jovian planets are probably like comet sweepers, or they're dust sweepers, pulling away particles that would cause havoc upon the Earth itself. So they actually probably are there, put there by God to protect us. The plate tectonics theory of geology, the system presently espoused by most atheists, has the geologic activity to be concentrated along the boundaries between the plates. But that's not always the case. But there are many areas near the middle of the plate that are quite active, such as the Hawaiian volcanoes and the seismic activity we see in China as well. Here you can see the arrow pointing up from Hawaii. Here's Hawaii, and there's the plate, the Pacific plate. So we have the Pacific plate, and it's pretty much almost in the middle of that plate. There's volcanic activity there. And so we find it's not always on the boundaries of the plates. Very interesting. Something else occurs. We have something else called polystrate fossils. Poly is from polus, the Greek word, and so it's in many stratas. So the fossil occurs in many stratas of rock. Some fossils are in several layers of the rocks. A number of fossils have been found extending through several feet of strata. Very interesting here. Workers in the Dacolite division of Grefco Incorporated have found the fossil skeleton of a baleen whale some 10 to 12 million years old in the company's diatomaceous earth quarries in Lompoc, California. California. The whale is standing on end in the quarry and is being exposed gradually as the diatomite is mined. The fossil may be close to 80 feet long. Geikie says it's not uncommon for certain carboniferous sandstones to find huge celluloid or coniferous trunks embedded in the upright or inclined positions, whereas in figure 227, the trees actually grew on the spot where their stems remained. It is evident that the rate of deposit of sediment which entombed them must have been sufficiently rapid to have allowed a mass of 20 or 30 feet to accumulate before the decay of the wood. So they had very quickly. For a long time, the coniferous sequence of Nova Scotia has been known for its upright fossils. Epidendrolis fossil. And so we have two different fossils are also present. The fossil upright trees are found in both sandstone and shale beds, although more commonly in the former. Occasionally, an upright tree will pass through an alternating sandstone shale series. Usually, the trunks are in a state of excellent preservation. Their height varies from less than a meter to as much as several meters. The beds with upright trees often contain stigmaria, sometimes spread through the entire thickness of the bed. In both stigmarian beds on Cape Breton Island, well-preserved upright trunks have been found, Rupke tells us. Solid trees become rotten stumps before they become protected against further decay by surrounding sediment. It is hard to see how the hollowed bark tubes of the Carboniferous could resist decay and be perfectly well preserved to a height of sometimes several meters, thus protected by rapidly deposited sediment. That sounded like flood to me. Rapidly deposited sediment. Rupke tells us further it's not uncommon to find stigmaria specimens filled with sediment different from the surrounding rock. The filling may be sandstone, the bed may be shale, or the reverse. So this hollow tube is filled with shale or sandstone, and the things around the tube are the opposite, shale or sandstone. This demonstrates that the shale and sandstone were formed both alternately and quickly in harmony with my Fox flood model. In 1959, Broadhurst and McGraw described a fossilized tree in position of growth from the coal major, the Black Rod near Wigram in Lancashire, that's in England. This tree was preserved as a cast, and the evidence available suggested that the cast was at least 38 feet, 11.6 meters in height. The original tree must have been surrounded and buried by sediment, which was compacted before the bulk of the tree decomposed, so that the cavity vacated by the tree could be occupied by new sediment, which formed the cast. So the tree decomposed, and then it was filled with more sediment. This implies a rapid rate of sedimentation around the original tree. Since this particular tree in Black Rod was described, more than 50 trees fossilized in position of growth have been observed in Lancashire, mostly on open cast coal workings. These trees are found at various horizons between coal seams, and they occur also in parting within coal seams. Trees occur in the roof beds of the coal seam. The root system is developed in the beds above the top of the coal with no case has the tree been observed to pass through the roof into the coal itself. So the roots did not go down into the coal. It is clear that the trees in position of growth are far from being rare in Lancashire. Presumably in all cases, it must have been a rapid rate of sedimentation. Fits my flood model quite well. This sedimentation occurred without doubt in water that could not have been fast flowing since the trees are left in standing position. It's possible that the land surface where the trees were inundated by floodwater, possibly on numerous successive occasions. And again, my flood model has a tidal flood occurring with water flowing back and forth. The erect floating of tree stumps has been reported by several observers. Masses of floating plant debris, including erect stumps, were seen off the coast of New Guinea. Ager told of palm trees standing upright in deep water. Stumps will float upright in deep water, especially if the roots enclose earth and rocks. A vertical floating log has been seen for years by park rangers in Crater Lake, Oregon. Upright logs and stumps sometimes become a hazard to boat travel in Puget Sound. This is coffin. These floating trees upright are totally in harmony with the Fox flood model. These polystrate fossils are what we would expect from the flood. And we have some pictures of these. Stutzer, and again, all of these are cited in the book. These trees were transported with pebbles enclosed in their roots because the occasional appearance of pebbles within the coal beds. These pebbles were floated into the coal swamp, as will be shown in another place, held by the interlaced roots of trees. So the trees were uprooted and then the pebbles then carried with them and deposited in the coal seams. In the coal majors of Nova Scotia, for example, the stumps and trunks of many trees are preserved standing upright as they grew, certainly having been buried before they had time to fall or rot away. Here, sediment certainly accumulated to a depth of many feet within a few years. In other formations where articulated skeletons of large animals are preserved, sediment must have covered them within a few days at the most. Dunbar and Rogers tell us. Abundant fossil shells likewise indicate rapid burial. For if shells are long exposed to the sea floor, they suffer abrasion from the movement of the water in the sand or corrosion and overgrown by successive organisms or perforated by boring animals. Some animals bore into them for the minerals in the shells, put holes in them. Now Ropp does, and he's an atheist. He writes, polystrate fossils, the creationists point out, probably correctly in most cases, that the occurrence of a long tree trunk in live position suggests extremely rapid deposition of the surrounding rock. He admits that. Otherwise, the tree trunk would have decayed and disappeared before it could be embedded. Now, Ropp is an atheist. Now, keep that in mind. Ropp admits that the atheists have ignored this question because he goes on and says, many of the examples of catastrophism now being cited by the scientific creationists were well known, but either ignored or given very secondary importance in 19th century geology and paleontology. We just ignored them, or we gave them lesser importance, secondary importance. Just brushed them off aside, brushed them aside. We just ignored the evidence, basically, is what he's saying. Ropp includes a picture of a 7.5 foot or 2.3 meter tall upright polystrate fossil tree as evidence of rapid burial. He states the fossil is a clear indication of rapid burial, and this sort of preservation is surprisingly common in geologic record. Why is it surprising? Because he's an atheist, he doesn't believe in the flood. That's why it's surprising. There's solid evidence against uniformitarianism, solid evidence against it. Evidence has existed, but has been ignored by the geologists because they had a preconceived notion that there is no God. That was their notion. This doesn't speak well for their honesty and their ability to evaluate the evidence clearly and fairly. If we cannot trust them to be honest in this area, can we trust them in other areas? That's a good question, isn't it? Claims have been made that human artifacts have been found in coal seams, but these claims have been ignored and brushed aside. Here's a polystrate fossil This is a little hammer for chipping out. Here's a little hammer for chipping them out. That's a polystrate fossil going through the rocks, through several layers of rocks. Explanation of the previous slide. Now, the Cumberland, this is in Pennsylvania formation. Explanation. Ancient in situ in place, lycopsid, probably sigillarea, with attached Sedimentation root. Specimen is from the Geologic formation, Pennsylvania, Cumberland Basin, Nova Scotia, one of the provinces in Canada. Right, here's another one going up, and you can see it going up here, going up. That's another one. Polystrate fossil. This is upright stigma area and dipping beds of Pennsylvania and Alien Formation in Bear Valley Strip Mine, Northumberland County, Pennsylvania, taken in 1998. Here's some more that we see out here. Polystrate fossils. Takapuna Reef's exceptional fossil forest was exhumed by coastal erosion when the sea level rose to its current height. So, again, this supposedly occurred following the last ice age of 7,200 years ago, supposedly. Here's some more polystrate fossils. We see them here, and the arrow is pointing to them here and over here, going out right through the rocks. Again, this shows that the rocks were laid very rapidly. These layers of rocks were laid rapidly. 3 trees in situ are in place, sitting in place. So this concludes our study tonight of this. This is a little shorter than I intended, but this concludes our study tonight of this. The atheist, I'm sorry, I'll go on a little while longer, has no suitable mechanism for the uplift of the continents. The large amounts of marine fossils on the continents suggest that these regions were underwater at some time, the time of the deposition of the sediments, marine fossils. Now, marine life is life that occurs in the ocean. Aquatic life is freshwater and freshwater. This is easily explained by a tidal flood. So the tidal flood of my flood model. There are 2 basic kinds of rocks: sialic, less dense rocks, and symmetric, more dense than sialic rocks. Conformity to the principle of isostasy, the lighter rocks float in the heavier magma, more dense molten rock. Now, this is an application of Archimedes' principle. Given an Earth with sialic continents floating in a denser symmetric substratum, what mechanism would cause a large volume of low-standing continents to rise rapidly a mile in the air? Furthermore, evidence from gravity surveys suggests that the rocks underlying the Colorado Plateau are in isostatic balance. That is, this large area is floating at its correct elevation in view of its mass and density. Recent seismic evidence confirms that we have then a double-ended mystery. This is a mystery to the atheists, not a mystery to me. For the Colorado Plateau seems to have grown downward at the same time that its emerged part rose upward. So it seemed to have grown on the bottom at the same time it grew on top. To date, the only hypothesis to explain the upward motion of large regions like the Colorado Plateau is that of convection currents. Slowly moving convection currents in the solid rocks some 40 to 50 kilometers below the surface of the Earth are presumed to have swept a great volume of light rock from some unidentified place to have deposited underneath the Colorado Plateau. Total volume of approximately 2.5 billion cubic miles of sialic rock It's necessary to account for the uplift of the Colorado Plateau. So you had to have a lot of rock. While it's not hard to visualize rocks as having no great strength at the high pressure and temperatures existing at depths of 40 to 50 kilometers, it's quite another matter to visualize currents in solid rock of sufficient magnitude to bring in and deposit this quantity of light material at a relatively uniform layer underneath the entire Colorado Plateau region. While it's not hard to visualize rocks as having no great strength, see? So he has a problem with this. Even more troublesome than the method of transporting all this light rock. Now, this is not Marion saying, I'm quoting these atheists. Even more troublesome than the method of transporting all this light rock. So we had to have light rock to get underneath the bottom of the continents to lift them up. That's what we had to have. Is the problem of its source. Where did it come from? The region from which the light rock was moved should have experienced spectacular subsidence. It should have sunk down. But no giant neighboring depressions are known, so we don't know where it came from. Well, that's a large problem. Is how such enormous quantities of light rock can be dispersed so uniformly over so large an area. So how can we get all this uniform so as to lift it up uniformly? And all this region be uplifted uniformly. What mechanism successfully raised and lowered the continents to place alternating marine and terrestrial sediments on the continents? So how did we get the continents raised up and then lowered again, back and forth? How did this occur? Now, the atheist must not only explain how the continents were uplifted, but it must explain how they were uplifted and lowered to allow for the deposition of marine fossils and uplifted and lowered repeatedly. How could this happen? Movement of millions of cubic miles of sahalic, less dense rock and symmetric, more dense rock is fantastic. So you got to move this light rock under to lift them up, and then you got to move some more dense rock under to pull it back down, put it under the ocean, back and forth. So that becomes a real problem. But again, my model of my flood model explains this quite readily. Now, we're going to stop here with this and begin with this in our next week. We'll stop at this point.